We're going to be in 2 Samuel 13 tonight, 2 Samuel 13. Back in the fall when we were looking at 1 Samuel, we were going through it, when we came along through 1 Samuel, we found there's a lot of treasures in this study of the United Kingdom that we've been looking at. One of the great treasures, I'd say, in 1 Samuel was the friendship that David and Jonathan had. It is a great, great example of the way that friends ought to be. And of course, just to remind you really quick, David and Jonathan really had every reason to not like each other, to not trust each other. You know, Jonathan was the rightful heir as far as human standards go to the throne, because his father's the king, and he's the most prominent of all the sons of Saul. And then there's David, who's been anointed to be the next king. And so those couple of facts make those two the most unlikely pair you can imagine. But yet, David's heart and Jonathan's heart both were linked closely to God. And Jonathan was a man of faith and a man of great strength, like David was. Remember, Jonathan did with his armor bearer, went out and fought the Philistines, the two of them together, and did something I would say every bit as remarkable as David killing Goliath. And so the attitude and the heart of both David and Jonathan were just very very similar. Now, if on one pendulum is the best example of friendship in the Bible, the other end of the pendulum, the worst friend in the Bible, is going to be in chapter 13. And the thing is, before we completely vilify the quote-unquote friend, I think a lot of people don't realize it, but there are a lot of friends in this world that are just like his friend. And I see them on Facebook every day. Every day. Friends that are giving advice just like the bad character here. And I'll show you, I'll give you great examples, not of individual people, but great examples of things that people say that seem harmless, that seem good, but are just as toxic as what this quote-unquote friend says and does in this text. Okay, verse 1, chapter 13. Now Absalom, David's son. That's a name you're going to remember in the next few chapters. We're going to look at it in the next few weeks. Absalom, of course, one of the most prominent sons of David, had a beautiful sister whose name was Tamar. And after a time, Amnon, David's son, now, because David had many wives, Absalom and Amnon are half-brothers, and therefore Tamar and Amnon are half-brother and sister. He loved her. And Amnon was so tormented that he made himself ill because of his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin. And it seemed impossible to Amnon to do anything to her. But Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab. The son of Shemaiah, David's brother. So Jonadab is a first cousin. Okay, it's all in the family. So it makes him a first cousin. So he's a first cousin, but he's a friend. And I'm putting air quotes around friend. Jonadab was a very crafty man. And he said to him, "O son of the king, why are you so haggard morning after morning? Will you not tell me?" Amnon said to him, I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister. Jonadab said to him. Now look at this. It's almost like he thought about this. It's almost like he's planned this. So he comes up with this plan. Lie down on your bed and pretend to be ill. And when your father comes to see you, say to him, let my sister Tamar come, give me bread to eat, and prepare the food in my sight, that I may see it and eat it from her hand. So Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill. When the king came to see him, Amnon said to the king, please let my sister come and make a couple of cakes in my sight, that I may eat from her hand. Now, let's back it up a little bit in the story. Amnon looks out of sorts to the point that his friend Jonadab says, why do you look so haggard every day? And Amnon's answer is, I want to be with my stepsister, Tamar. And, I don't have a way of doing that. Well, what's the kind of things that a friend, a real friend, would say or should say in that situation?
That's pretty messed up.
That's a good first place. That's pretty messed up. Dude, that's messed up. Usually colloquialism, however. Okay? That's probably a good first line. What else? I thought it was get a grip. You gotta figure something out. This is not going to work. To use a play on a euphemism of the day, that's 50 Shades of Wrong. You could say something like that. Just wrong every way. This is wrong in many, many ways. You can't do this. And, if anything, the suggestion that Tamar gave, that they would be allowed to marry in their society and their culture, there is at least a possibility that could have happened. So that would be a way that this could have maybe resolved itself in a much better way. But to do what Jonadab suggested was that, I guess he was suggesting that he would try to seduce her, and then if that didn't work, just whatever came along, whatever developed out of that. If you go to have a bad idea, you need a friend like Craig to say, that's messed up. You need somebody to say, that's not going to work. You don't do that. You can't do that. And he wasn't getting that. And so that is a terrible, terrible piece of advice. Now, here's where I say that I see this all the time, every single day. Now, they maybe don't say, here's what you do. But I see almost every single day things on Facebook like, you deserve to be happy. You deserve to feel good. You deserve to be in a relationship that makes you feel fulfilled. And those aren't necessarily bad pieces of advice, but in a context of they've left their spouse and they're living with somebody else at the moment, that's not the advice to give to them. I've got distant family that, they're in a bad situation, and people are like, oh, just so happy for you. And I'm like, they're living in sin, doing things they should not be doing, and people are gushing over them, and yes, you can be kind to them. Yes, you can show love to them. But, you know, anyway, it's just certainly a terrible situation that you find. And people say those kind of things all the time. Follow your heart. Do what feels right to you. And those are all what sound like and seem like good pieces of advice. But when people are doing and acting in wrong ways, just, you know, they're essentially being like Jonadab. Just whatever you want to do, you know, as long as you feel right, as long as you feel good about it or whatever. And in the process, they're maybe not saying what Jonadab did. Okay, they're maybe not saying, "Hey, lay a trap for somebody," but you hear that kind of advice to people all the time. It's all over the place. It's all over virtually every drama on television. That's the line of thinking of relationship to relationship to relationship. You know, you deserve to be happy and whatever, and never mind the entire debris field of relationships that are in the background of your life and all the things going on there. Like, well, wait a second. You know, where do you stop them? Well, oh yeah, I mean, there is a day of accounting. Yeah, absolutely, a judgment, and certainly that's the case. So, you know, we should be careful, you know, about the kind of advice that we give, that we're not condoning or pointing people toward doing just whatever they want, because the problem is, you know, they really should be trying to do what's right and do what God wants them to do. And, you know, Jonadab is doing everything wrong when it comes to how to help Amnon deal with the situation. You know, sometimes, in a lot of instances, it's important maybe not to go to a friend for advice. You know, because a lot of times young people don't realize this. A lot of their friends are going through the same things they are, but they're still struggling with those things. You know, it might be a good idea to go to somebody that's a little bit further down the road that can kind of look back and say, okay, here's what I wish I'd done differently, or here's what I would change, or here's how I could give you advice on that kind of thing. Because a lot of times peers aren't seeing the big problems. Well, Jonadab, if Jonadab is not the worst friend in the Bible, I don't know who is. Anybody have a suggestion of somebody worse than Jonadab? Yeah, I didn't think so, but you know, maybe somebody will come up with something. But Jonadab's terrible in his advice to Amnon. And they are concocting this story. Now, I want to step aside from this story and let's go back to the previous story we're looking at. We've just looked at the previous chapter a couple weeks ago, was when David was confronted with, when David committed sin with Bathsheba and was confronted with the fact that he had done this. Last week we looked, of course, at Psalm 51 and looked at how David repented and David's heart, and how that he changed, and how that he poured himself out to God and sought forgiveness of all of that, and wrote one of the most beautiful and powerful pieces in all of Scripture in Psalm 51. And that largely as a result of being confronted about his sin. Now, I don't believe that the ends justify the means by any stretch. But because David went through that, the 51st Psalm is the result, and many, many, many people benefit from reading the 51st Psalm. And like I say, I don't see it that's the ends justifying it. And David did wrong and clearly was displeasing to God by doing that. Anyway, so there is that ending to that story. But here's what I've got to say. Because David did what he did, we're not told, okay? We're not told, but because of what David did, I see this in a way being that influence. Because now you have a son of David who is, let's face it, this is pretty similar to what David did with Bathsheba.
I think it goes a little more than that. It goes directly back to chapter 12, verses 10 through 12, what Nathan said. I think there may have been a hand in that as well, too, after what David had done, what caused all his family to turn. So,
Right. Yeah, and there is promise that there's going to be essentially a lot of fallout. That there's going to be that he's going to be essentially deposed, and he said, Nathan says a neighbor, but it's actually his son, Absalom, later on, is going to end up being with David's concubines and doing that. But clearly there is the residual fallout from what David had done. But Amnon is in a lot of ways doing what David did with Bathsheba. And we don't know exactly the nature of the tryst, if you will, between David and Bathsheba, and to the extent that she was in consent of that or whatever. It does seem like she was, but yet still her being just a citizen and being a king in a time which a king can do pretty much whatever he wants, you don't know how much say she had in it. But Amnon's acting a lot like David, and I wonder, we can only suppose, but that he feels emblazoned and bold to do this because of what he saw his father do. And there's no way to know that for sure, but it just kind of feels like, okay, look at what Dad did. And never mind the fact that David disavowed himself of it and sought forgiveness of it, but yet, as people, the vast majority of the time, we grow up to do what our parents did. Let's face it, we do that as people. The majority of us fall into habits of what we see our parents do. Not always. Cycles get broken, but the cycles are there for that reason. And often that takes place. And so, I can't help but see this as a part of that fallout, as a part of that's happened because of what David had done. And so, David couldn't go back on that, but David, it's something that's going to happen because of what the mistakes that David made. And sometimes mistakes are made, sins made, and you might recover, but the subsequent generation doesn't. And all the more reason why it's important for all of us to set good examples. And if we find ourselves with parents that made bad decisions, it makes it even more important to stop the cycle, to stop the pattern, and make a change. Because we can do that. We all are responsible for ourselves. But Amnon is largely doing what David did. So, Amnon asks, his father comes in, and he asks his father to have Tamar come in. and make a couple cakes in his sight and eat those from her hand. And so verse 7, David sent home to Tamar saying, "Go to your brother Amnon's house and prepare food for him." So Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house where he was lying down. And she took dough and kneaded it and made cakes in his sight and baked the cakes. And she took the pan and emptied it out before him, but he refused to eat. And Amnon said, "Send out everyone from me." So everyone out from him. And Amnon said to Tamar, "Bring the food into the chamber that I may eat from your hand." And Tamar took the cakes that she had made and brought them into the chamber to Amnon her brother. But when she brought them near him to eat, she took hold of her and said to her, "Come and lie with me, my sister." She answered him, "No, my brother, do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this outrageous thing. As for me, where could I carry my shame? And as for you, you would be as one of the outrageous fools in Israel. Now therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you." And he would not listen to her. And being stronger than she, he violated her and lay with her. She even suggests, now whether that was a ploy to get out of that moment and then it be dealt with later, but if it was true, that she suggests that they would get married to make this not such a bad thing. And so, that's what she asked for. She begs for him not to do this. And yet, it says that, of course, he was stronger than her, and he rapes her, is what happens. And then verse 15, then Amnon hated her with a great hatred, so that the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. And that I think a lot of times is where these kind of individuals end up murdering a lot of times the person that they're with. That's kind of like a switch gets flipped, and they show rage and hatred toward the person that they've violated or abused or whatever. And he tells her to get up and go, but she said to him, "No, my brother, this wrong is sending me away is greater than the other that you did to me." But he would not listen to her. And he called the young men who served him and said, "Put this woman out of my presence," and bolt the door after her. And so you think about the sin that Amnon has done, and about how he has violated his sister. And you think about this, and Amnon might have done this on his own. We don't know that. But he had a friend that said, "Hey, here's what you do." And gave him terrible advice on how to do this. Any questions or comments as we are to this point? Yes?
He doesn't look like his feet were that right. He wants his sister to cook for him. He wants to eat out of her pan. These are adults. He wants the food moved to his bedroom. He wants all the men to be put out of the house. There's nobody to help her. Did anybody think maybe this was a good idea?
Well, that's true. This idea of being alone and doing all this, at some point, you realize this, but then again, you'd think, you just think and assume that being brother and sister, that it wouldn't be that. But you're right, and it goes to show the importance of accountability, and that's why it is important that people act in an accountable way, and so it's when that is not there, then more and more decisions get worse and worse. Anything else? Yes, Steve?
The wise man said in Proverbs 27, verse 5, open rebuke is better than love carefully concealed, and faithful are the wounds of a friend.
Yeah.
If a friend hurts us for our own good,
Yeah.
that's a good friend.
Yeah. You know, if Jonadab had slapped him upside the head, that would have been kind of like what that said in Proverbs. That, you know, if he gave him a wound, gave him a, you know, bloody nose or a fat lip, then that might have been a good thing. You know, because that's kind of what Amnon needed. He needed a good whack upside the head. What are you thinking? And that's certainly the case. And so a good friend would have stopped him from doing this. And just think about what a terrible thing this is. Well, Tamar runs out. She of course is wearing the robes that the usual princesses wore, the king's daughters. And we'd call her a princess. And she went out, tore her long robe that she wore, and put ashes on it. And so she went out crying and mourning. And then Absalom, her brother, her full brother, sees her, and he gathers what's happened and figures out that Amnon has violated her. And Absalom says, don't worry about it, I'll take care of it. In essence, hold your peace, my sister, he is your brother, do not take this to heart. And so Tamar lived, a desolate woman, in her brother Absalom's house. When David heard all these things, he was very angry. But Absalom spoke to Amnon, neither good nor bad. But Absalom hated Amnon because he had violated his sister Tamar. That's a mouthful right there. Absalom takes care of his sister, right thing to do. And what does it say about David? He was angry. David is a great man. We've looked at David, and we've looked at a lot of great things about David. But David wasn't perfect. We already know that from his sin with Bathsheba and his trying to killing Uriah. But David also fails as a father in different ways. David is angry, but what does he do about it? What gets done about it? Nothing. You know, he's angry, but David doesn't, you know, grab hold of Amnon and straighten him out. Nothing. There's nothing that's done. And maybe David looks at the situation and says, well, how can I do anything? What standing do I have to tell Amnon what he did was wrong? Again, because of his own sin, because of his own background, now I would say this plays into why he doesn't address his son. Because he knows he's got skeletons in his closet. And all the more reason why there's collateral damage to the sin that David committed with Bathsheba and had Uriah killed, because I would say that this plays pretty big into David being a very ineffective father in this circumstance. Because, you know, there should have been some consequences for this. There should have been something. You know, he's king after all. This is his son. There should have been some consequences. You know, the old law would have stated, the old law was that he would have to marry her and never divorce her, take care of her all his life. That's what the old law would have been. And if he refused to do that, then he maybe be killed or something along those lines. But he'd have had to take care of her and other things that it seems like there were no consequences at all to what Amnon did.
The consequences were strictly for Tamar. because she
Yeah.
was no longer marriageable, and as a princess, that was her value, to make an advantageous marriage to benefit the kingdom and benefit the king. That was off the table. There was never going to be a marriage for her. That's why her desolation was so great.
Yeah.
She was stuck as a spinster for the rest of her life through no fault of her own.
Yeah, she was the purely innocent party in all of that. I mean, at this point, Absalom hasn't done anything wrong, but we probably about all know the rest of the story. Yeah, Tamar's the only innocent party in this, and Absalom's doing right by his sister by taking care of her, but Absalom has a plan, and he carries that out at the end of the chapter. And Absalom, I don't know. If David had enacted real consequences on Amnon, then maybe Absalom wouldn't have seen fit to take matters into his own hands. Maybe if David had enacted some punishment, enacted some kind of thing that he had to do right by Tamar to the best of his ability to take care of her and whatever, then maybe things would have been better. But because David did nothing, Absalom is over here off to the side, and he's stewing, and it's kind of simmering, and it's going to boil over one day. 2 full years, and nobody has said boo to Amnon. What a terrible thing. The sheep shearers are coming. They're at Baal Hazor. It's near Ephraim. And then Absalom invited all the king's sons. They're going to go have a party and appreciate the time up there together while they're doing the sheep shearing and have a party up there. And Absalom says, please let the king and his servants go with your servant. And the king said to Absalom, no, my son, let us not all go, lest we're burdensome to you. David says, I won't go, but you can send your brothers. And he pressed him, and he would not go, but gave him his blessing. And Absalom said, if not, please let my brother Amnon go with us. And the king said to him, why should he go with you? But Absalom pressed him until he let Amnon and all the king's sons go. What happens? We've got about 5 minutes, so I want to keep it short. Absalom tells his servants, notice when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say to you, strike Amnon, then kill him. Do not fear. Have I not commanded you to be courageous and valiant? Okay, there's a gang of them, and the guy's drunk, and they have to be courageous and valiant to kill him. Well, he is the king's son after all, but he's a drunk man, and there's a bunch of them. And they're going to arise and kill him. And so they do. They kill kill Amnon. And when they do, all the rest of the sons of David, Absalom's brothers, they take off. They scatter for the 4 corners. And word, skipping down through some verses, the word gets to David that all the king's sons are being killed by Absalom. But no, that's not true. And there happens to be somebody there to tell the king the truth. Verse 32. But Jonadab, we've heard that name before. But Jonadab, the son of Shemaiah, David's brother, said, let not my lord suppose that they have killed all the young men of the king's sons, for Amnon alone is dead. For by the command of Absalom, this has been determined from the day he violated his sister Tamar. Now therefore let not my king, lord the king, so take it to heart, so as to suppose that all the king's sons are dead, for Amnon alone is dead. Now do you want, once you get the immensity of that, the person that tells the king that Amnon is being killed is the guy that gave him the bad advice. And also there's another little bit of truth that slips out. And that is that Absalom has set to do this since the day that he violated Tamar. So, apparently, Jonadab has been sitting on this little knowledge that Absalom is out to kill Amnon for a long time. Now, we're not told that he told Amnon that. In fact, he probably didn't. Or else Amnon wouldn't have gone to that feast that was there. So, Jonadab gave him horrible advice and then withheld advice that would have saved his life, potentially. Jonadab takes the prize by a country mile, as far as I'm concerned. As far as the worst friend you're ever going to find. And, you know, you look at that and think what a terrible thing it is. Absalom flees away from the presence of the king because of this. He flees and goes out of the land. And he went to Talmai, to the son of Ammihud, the king of Jeshurun, and he stayed there. And is there a good while David mourns for Amnon and mourns eventually over Absalom being gone. And David, of course, weeps bitterly when he hears about Amnon dying. So I've got to wonder if there might have been a little bit of regret, a little bit of guilt in David seeing this and seeing what happens. Any questions, comments? Final things. We've got about a minute. That's how not to do it, folks. You know, you have a friend that's ready to jump off a cliff, ready to make the worst decision in their life. Do something to stop them. Encourage them to do what's right. Encourage them to do what honors God. Encourage them to live the way that they should. And what a good thing it is. Now, Kevin sent me a text a while ago and said if Tamar and Amnon had moved to Kentucky, it would have been okay to marry. But that's on Kevin. So I did have to throw a little tidbit in there to you. Of course, some people say that about this great stage, too. Anyway.